So, for those of you that missed last week's lesson on managing conflict and negotiation, just go over some of the key points from the slide deck, the reading, and the doctrinal reference.
Telling the truth is not in the cards right now. I thought you'd be excited to have an acting job.
If it's an acting job, we should get paid.
Yeah, you're gonna get paid in experience.
I want to actually get paid.
All right, what do you want?
$600 for the day, plus overtime if we go over 8 hours. I'll do my own hair and makeup, and I want you to pay for the 6-week intensive acting camp that my mom can't afford.
$50 for the day and a 2-week acting class at the YMCA nearest you.
$500 and a 4-week acting class.
$300 and a 3-week class.
Done.
I would have done it for $500.
I would have done it for the experience.
So, kind of a funny little video clip, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. So, going to talk about conflict and negotiation, and then the soldier-leader engagement. So, conflict, you could read the slide there, but it's inevitable. Like we talked about last week and the week before that, leadership is a human endeavor. And when you're dealing with other human beings, interests aren't never necessarily going to align. And so, as we said, in any sort of relationship, whether that's romantic or a friendship or even your relationship with family, there are interests that don't align, and therefore you have conflict. So. What we talked about last week was the fact or the concept that negotiation really boils down to communication. And since both parties want an outcome or they want something, the best way to serve both interests is through the communication process and trying to get some semblance of a compromise, which is they both get a mutually acceptable outcome. So if you're acknowledging up front that you may not necessarily get your ideal outcome, but you will get something that is acceptable to you, that is what negotiation enables. So as we saw in the video, there was two parties. They had conflicting interests, but in the end, through some back and forth negotiation, they were able to achieve a compromise. And so in that example, there was the high ball, low ball technique, which, the starting side begins with, something that is their ideal outcome, but they know in their mind that they're willing to accept something less. All right, so that's an important concept to think about. So the soldier-leader engagement, interpersonal interaction. All right, so that's the key takeaway. It's an interaction between two people. It should be face-to-face. It should not be done through email. It should not be done through memo or anything like that. As we said before, it's a human endeavor. And that interpersonal interaction is something that cannot be replicated through written messages. So we'll talk briefly about opportunistic or scheduled interactions or engagements. So these are some principles of soldier-leader engagement: consistent, culturally aware, adaptive, credible, balanced, and pragmatic. Okay, so these are just some principles that you can follow when doing a soldier-leader engagement. Obviously, I think most of these are self-explanatory. I just went back one slide there. Consistent, so no matter, there's always stuff going on, but if you want to maximize this concept, you have to be consistent. Culturally aware, understanding that there's more than one perspective. Culture has been defined in a variety of ways, but it's a set of shared values and beliefs And so if you aren't necessarily from the same culture as your soldier, you need to take into account kind of where they come from, because that is going to affect the communication process. Adaptive, all right. So it's rarely going to go the way that you think it's going to go, because the variable is the soldier. Trust, all right, through credibility, all right. And we talked about the concept of trust last semester when we were talking about mission command. We've also briefly mentioned it during our discussions of the Army profession, but you have to have credibility in order to have an effective engagement. Balanced, all right, so this is kind of where that compromise comes in. Win-win situation. Both parties should benefit, or all parties should benefit from, that engagement. And then pragmatism, reflect the expectation and acceptance of prudent risk in negotiation. All right, so we talked about deliberate versus dynamic. All right, and I think the big takeaway here is that the dynamic engagement, those occur routinely, and so you as the leader need to be able to take advantage of those engagements whenever you can. There is a place for deliberate engagements, specifically when it comes to scheduling counseling or things like that. As many of you have already had experience at this point, those can be effective because they give the leader the opportunity to prepare some points of discussion, and so it should not be a one-sided conversation, but the leader has prepared for that meeting or that engagement. All right, so real quick, we're going to jump over to the doctrinal reference, which is ADRP 6-22, Army Leadership. All right, when it comes to conflict and negotiations. So real quick, I want to go back over, because this is really important, the Army Leadership Requirements Model. All right, so the three attributes of character, presence, and intellect, and the three competencies of leads, develops, and achieves make up the Army Leadership Requirements Model. All right, so these three attributes and these three competencies make the Army Leadership Requirements Model. So what is the doctrinal reference to managing conflict? And so when we talked about leadership as a human endeavor, and you were acknowledging that your soldiers all come from different backgrounds and have different competence levels and different levels of commitment, there is inevitably going to be conflict. And so what do you as the leader do? How do these attributes and competencies tie to that concept of working through those conflicts? So if you go to Chapter 6, so if you see here, Part 3, Competency-Based Leadership for Direct through Strategic Levels, it's under the actual leader competency of leads. All right, so specifically, resolving conflicts here, and so there's a couple of takeaways here that I want you to look at. So again, the leader competency of leads. All right, so leads. All right. And so one individual or group perceives that another individual or group negatively affects their interest. So I talked about that at the beginning of the lesson. Individuals have conflicting interests. As a leader, it is important to identify and resolve conflict before it affects personal and organizational functioning and effectiveness. So that is one of your responsibilities, to ensure that you are managing any conflicts within your formation. Further, in this, under the extending influence beyond the chain of command, subcompetency, right? Extends influence beyond the chain of command. That's when it also talks about conflict. All right. So negotiating, building consensus, and resolving conflict. And it basically talks about some things that leaders should do. So understand and be willing to challenge assumptions about all parties involved, the desired outcome, the situation, and the negotiation itself. So the actual student reading kind of touches on this. Consider the measures of success for negotiation. Prepare thoroughly. And that, I think that really just comes down to just being as knowledgeable about the facts and situation as possible. And then build these effective working relationships based on genuine rapport, respect, and reputation. That initial credibility going into a negotiation can give you a lot of influence in the outcome of that negotiation. Let's say if you're a mediator, because they're willing to listen to what you have to say. Typically, if you look at like couples counseling or something like that, a lot of times one or both parties will be very hesitant to really listen to the counselor if they had never met them before. And so it takes several visits to build that rapport and a level of trust. So it's just something to think about. Meaningful communication. All right, so we come back to this word of communication, and that's what is the most important thing when it comes to negotiating conflicts. Generate many options or creative solutions. All right, that meet the interest of all parties. So that, remember, it goes back to that win-win situation. Objective, balanced, and fair criteria. Alternatives to a negotiated agreement. Commit to an agreement only if it is better than alternatives, is the best of many options, and meets interest based on fair criteria. All right, so if you go deeper into the competency of extends influence beyond chain of command, this is where it talks about it. Negotiates, builds consensus, and resolves conflict. All right, so again, here we see two-way meaningful communication. All right, so just real quickly jumping over to this student reading, one of the key takeaways here is avoid some of these assumptions, right? Look, it's obvious that, that's basically, you're not really treating that audience with respect, assuming the other side is biased, assuming really anything, other side's motivations are obvious. Avoid making open-ended offers, unilateral offers. All right, and this is more of a business style strategy, but there are some takeaways. So this is pretty important. Build trust first. All right, so that's just a recap of last week's lesson on negotiating conflict.